we're going to start in the word Vayeitzei, which is the idea of to go on or to go out, if you would prefer that. I'm going to do 2 or 3 sections, and then I'm going to let you talk to me and ask me questions, if you don't mind if I do that first. So I want you to look first off at back in verse number 10, which is the beginning of that section. And we're going to be looking for those first few verses all the way down to about 20. Okay. So it begins by saying Jacob departed, Vayeitzei, from Beersheba and went toward Haran. Now, the thing that we have to understand is that there's a rather interesting point here. When we go through this, he begins by telling us that he went from Beersheba and went towards Haran. Now, we're not sure whether he made it or not. Most scholars think he did make it, and he made it in one day, just as Eliezer made it from Hebron, where he was with Abraham, all the way up to Haran. He made it in a day. So this is the second of those meetings. Now it says he departed, and we can take it on the physical level that he literally did depart from where he was at and he went to where he was going. But we also have another thing. The spiritual side, or the deeper meaning of this, is the fact that he left the soul, his soul left from God and came here. It departed down. And so that's another way of looking at this. Now, the fact that he went towards Haran, he went towards the world, because the Haran is about dryness. It's about frustration and anger. It's the idea of the fact that when you enter into this world, and the older you get, the more you can understand confusion and the uncertainties that we go through each and every day, depending on what's going on in our lives. And then in verse 11, interesting word, he encountered. He encountered the place. Now, you and I can encounter each other. We come from different directions and we meet. How do you encounter a place? How does a place move? And that's the geophysics of the problem, because it appears as though that was the intended word. It was meant for us to understand that he was going from here to there, and that it came towards him. Now, in science, Albert Einstein, while he was riding on a train, realized the fact that as he was moving one direction, the trees were moving in the opposite direction. They were moving towards him. So he said it was an encounter with the trees as he passed. And that's the same way we talk about time. Time passes. But in this particular case, it appears as though he had gone to Haran and he said, oops, I forgot something, and went back to Israel, back to the land. And as he goes back to the land, he's headed someplace, but we're not sure exactly where he's headed. But as he's headed there, he encounters this place. This place springs up in front of him. That's what's going on at this particular point in time. So he's going to encounter this place. Now, there's lots of, the chronology of this chapter is not very good. I'll have to start there because we're really not sure how it all fit together. We know there are several events that have been left off the list. One of those events is after he left Beersheba, he encounters Eliphaz. And this is a midrashic writing, and it's found in the book of Jasher also. And so the story goes that back in chapter 27, I think it is, or 25, Esau understands the fact that Jacob has now taken his birthright and he's also taken his blessing. And so Esau wants Jacob dead. And so Esau will contract with his grandson, or his son Eliphaz, and he tells Eliphaz to go find Jacob and kill him. And so he takes 10 of his brothers. Now, they're not all from his family, but he takes 10 of his brothers and they go to this place and they encounter him there, or they meet him. Now, Jacob understands what's going to happen. So Jacob, in turn, convinces them they don't want him. How does he do that? He begins by bartering. And so he will give to Eliphaz all of his wealth. Because remember, when you go to marry somebody, there's a offering that's presented to her once he gets there. And so all of that money, the jewels or gold or whatever it was that he was taking with them, Eliphaz and the 10 take with them and leave him alone. So he now moves on towards Haran without anything, no dowry, no money, nothing. He will go up there in that same day and come back again. Some people think that's when he was interrupted, because according to the Midrash, the whole story of Eliphaz takes place at Shechem. And you remember Shechem was one of the first places Jacob will come to as he comes back into the land. And so that story is going on. Now, at the same point in time, then maybe he goes from Shechem down to the place. We're never told exactly. But once he arrives at this particular place, once he gets there, he finds himself, well, look what it says in verse 11. And he entered the place, or he encountered the place, and he spent the night there because the sun had set. And so he took stones of the place, which had arranged around his head, and he laid down in that place. So you see the word place is there several times. They didn't need to put it there, but they put it there because it's a reference. Now, if you want to understand it grammatically or gematria wise, the mathematics of it, the word place, makom, is going to appear 72 times in the Bible. 36 of those times, or half of them, will be found in the Torah. The other half will be found in the Tanakh, the rest of the Bible, the histories and the writings, all of those things. So the word is used 36 and then 36 more. Now, in our story, the place is never identified. In fact, it's not until David that we actually identify the place. Even when Abraham encountered the place, because that's the first time it's happened, is he knows that he's going to a place. And so for the very first time, we see that it's the place, but it's never identified as where it is or what it is. In fact, if we look at it at this place, we're going to find out that it has 3 different ideas behind it. Hold on a second. There's 3 different ideas that goes with this. The first idea is that when Abraham encountered the place, he saw it as a mountain. And so he went from the low country. Remember, he takes Isaac with him and he leaves Sarah behind in Hebron and he goes to the place. Now, while he's going to this place at the same point in time, it's high, and he'll pass through several midrashic stories where he has to fight different kinds of disasters, including one of them, which is an imaginary river that is flowing extremely fast in front of him that he has to figure out how he can cross until he steps into it and it disappears. And all of these things were supposedly perpetrated by Hasatan. Well, that's the first time. The second time we see this place is in Genesis chapter 24, when Isaac is out in the field and he is praying at this field. And so the place is now a field. At first it's a mountain and now it's a field. And then he continues on and we find the place here, and eventually we'll find out the place is not a mountain and it's not a field, it's a house. 3 different ways to describe this same place. And so the question came to everyone's mind, why 3? What's going on? What do I need to understand? And so as we're looking at it, we have to see that 2 of them are natural structures. One of them, a mountain. How do you remove a mountain? Another is a field. Both of them seem permanent, but yet at the same point in time, they will be the temporary. What will be permanent will be the house. So Jacob receives the house, the permanency. So if he's getting the permanency, then what is the mountain? What is the field? What do they represent? Well, the 3 come to the conclusion, Rashi among all of the others comes to the conclusion that what we're talking about are the temples, the 3 houses. The first temple was a rock. It was built with multiple stonework. All kinds of extras were added to it by Solomon that were gifted to them by David. Remember, David was the character who spent his time with Samuel while they sat in his tent, and they began to query themselves and try to find out where this place was. Because in book of Deuteronomy, all we understand is you will go to this place that I have set my name. And so that's the place that he's looking for. David finds it in the midst of a battle. He's overtaking the Jebusites that were in the city, and he sees the place located. And so that's the first time. Then the second time, it was built on the open field. It was where, again, the second temple was built by Ezra and Nehemiah. And so as we look at that second temple, again, it was not permanent. It again fell apart. But Jacob is talking about a temple because he's looking up into the heavens. And as he's looking up into the heavens, he sees the house of God. And so we now find that there's going to be a permanency there. And so that's the third temple that we're going to actually see. Oh, by the way, 72. 72 is the number for Hesed, loving kindness. So the building structure was there for loving kindness because God chose to make it there. 36 is also the value of the word for tent. So we get lots of understandings and lots of meanings that are going through here. Let me go back and try to read it again. So in verse 12, it says, he dreamt, and behold, a ladder was set earthward, and its top reached heavenward. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, Hashem was standing over him. And he said, I am Hashem, God of Abraham, your father, and God of Isaac. The ground upon which you are lying, and to you I will give it, and to your descendants. And your offspring shall be the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out powerfully westward, eastward, northward, and southward. And all of the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and by your offspring. Behold, I am with you, and I will guard you wherever you go, and I will return to you this soil, for I will not forsake you until I will have done what I have spoken about you. Jacob woke from his sleep and said, surely Hashem is in this place, and I did not know. And he became frightened, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the abode of God, and this is the gate of the heavens. Jacob arose early in the morning, took the stone that he placed around his head, and he set up as a pillar, and he poured oil on its top, and he named the place Bethel. However, Luz was the city's name originally, but it wasn't a city because you see, he wasn't in the town. Jacob was outside the walls of this city. He did not get his dream while he's with other people. The dream came to him outside. And there's lots of other inconsistencies in our story. If we go back earlier to the point of him laying down, remember he makes for himself a bed. Not a bed of a stone, but stones, plural. So he's finding himself building it, but he doesn't necessarily build it in an easy fashion, because before he even begins to pick up the first rock to make his bed, we find that because the sun had set. The reason Jacob stops here, besides the encounter that he has here, is because of the fact that the sun went down and he couldn't see where he was going. It was dark. And so in the midst of this darkness, he begins to build for himself a bed. And he uses these stones as his, well, not just simply for his head. You wouldn't need 12 stones for your head, but that's what the Midrash says, he had 12. But you gather these stones from this place. Now, he did not know, and according to the Midrash, the stones that he gathered were actually 12 stones that he took right out of the altar that Isaac was put upon. And those were where the stones came from. And so he places the stones in a configuration around him to protect himself, to hide himself from the wild animals, is what was imagined at that point in time. So he takes these stones and he surrounds himself with the stones. And so that's where he will lay down. Now, some people will tell you that this is the last time that Jacob will sleep for many years, because he will find himself at one point with Shem and Ever at their school, and he will spend 14 years learning before he even begins to go to Haran. So he doesn't leave immediately after leaving the town. He simply stays at Shem or Shalem, which is the city where Shem is occupying. If we want to get a picture, Mount Moriah was above Shalom, the city. And so he will leave that mountain, go down and go into the school where he will spend the next 14 years learning. And they say that he does not sleep because of the fact he is so fascinated by everything that he's learning that he continually wakes himself and he's constantly learning. And so that's what he does for 14 years. Now, after that, he will now go to Haran, but not before he has gone through those 14 years. Now, back to the mountain, back to the field, back to the house. Now, while he is there, one of the things that we have to understand is the fact that he has built himself this, and as he's lying himself down, all of a sudden he sees a ladder descending from heaven towards earth. But at the same time, he sees from the bottom, from the ground, he sees angels going up and then descending. Now, this is his first prophetic vision that he's now going to receive. And the dreams that are prophetic are done in isolation. In other words, there's no one else around. And that's why God has chosen not to bring him into town or into an inn or anywhere else. He has him out in the country. And so he's now laying outside in this particular place. And at this particular point in time, he finds himself there. And while he's there, the dream begins. Now, there are two possibilities, well, there's more than two, but I want to give you two understandings of why the ladder and where it's coming from. First off, the word for ladder is sulam. Now, the word sulam has a mathematical formula. It equals 208, I think, 231. The same value is the value of Sinai, the place where the 10 Commandments were given. So there's a understanding that this ladder is the same ladder that Moses would have seen coming and going as he goes up onto the mountain. So it's 130, I'm sorry. Sinai and Siloam are 130. So in this particular process then, he sees the angels coming and going. And notice that they go up first and then they come down. Now, to explain this, one understanding is that he's receiving the same prophetic vision in a different format that what Abraham received when Abraham learned in Genesis chapter 15 about the 4 major kingdoms that his people would have to live under. And so that's the idea of the first angel going up 70 steps and then coming back down was the 70 steps that belonged to the nation of Babylon. Then he would watch going up, he would watch the Medo-Persian Empire and their angel, and he'd come back down. And he watched the Greek Empire rise, and he watched them come down. And finally, he watched the Edomite Empire, but it didn't come down, which was the curiosity. It disappeared in the clouds. So that was one understanding of this. The second understanding is the fact that the angels themselves were representative not just of nations, but every event that occurs comes by way of God. Nothing happens to us without first passing through God's hands, and that coming by way of angelic messengers. And so we watch these messengers come and go over time. And so that was another understanding of what's going on. So as we're looking at this particular set of events, we find now that he's received this vision and this understanding of what's going to happen to his people, all of those things prior to even being married. And so now he leaves Bethel, goes and studies, leaves his study and goes up to Haran. And for that, we need to go to chapter 29. And I want you to look at the first 3 verses. It says, so Jacob lifted his face. He went towards the land of the Easterners. Notice he didn't go north, he went east. And he looked, and behold, a well in the field. And behold, 3 flocks of sheep lay there beside it. For from the well that they would water the flocks, and the stone over the mouth of the well was large. And when all the flocks would be assembled, there they would roll up the stone from the mouth of the well and the water and water their sheep. And then they would put the stone back over the mouth of the well in its place. It took multiple men in order to move that rock. And that's why those three sets of sheep were now laying there waiting for more help before they got anywhere. So this is the well of Haran. It's outside the city, but that's where the shepherds had gathered in order to begin the process. So arriving there, he sees the heavy stone. He sees people waiting. He begins to understand why they're waiting. They begin to have a conversation with him about who he was, what he was doing there, what's going on. And in the midst of that, if we go down to verse 9, it says, while he was speaking, still speaking with them, Rachel had arrived with her father's flock, for she was a shepherdess. And it was when Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the flock of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came forward and rolled the stone off the mouth of the well and watered the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel, and he raised his voice and he wept. Jacob told Rachel, that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. Then she ran and told her father. Okay, too heavy for 3 shepherds to lift, but it was not too heavy for Jacob to lift. So we get an understanding of how strong he was at this particular point in time. So he's the one who actually moves it off the well. Now, Rachel, her name means ewe, as in the sheep. Now, they say that her name was given that way because she was white and pure. And so that would give us an understanding. Now, the value of her name is 238. Now, I don't have a single word to replace it, but I want to give you the hint that there in Genesis 1 and 3, there is a moment where it says, Vayihi or, and let there be light. Jacob left darkness. He's now entered into the light at this particular point in time. She speaks of light. He's now reaching this point. Now, he fell in love with her instantly. It was not a question of, let me take time, let's see what your sister looks like and all of the other things. He loved her from the beginning. In fact, in the very beginning, he weeps over her. Again, multiple reasons why he would have wept. The one that would have gone along with earlier was the fact that he had lost all of his valuables. He had nothing to present to her. Remember, Eleazar, when he came up, brought 10 camel loads of things to present. Jacob has nothing. And so he may have wept over that fact. The second thought that's held by most of them is the fact that Jacob saw in Rachel, that she would die young, that she would not be able to carry it all the way to the very end as he wanted to. And so the two of them, he wept on her shoulder as he was heartbroken over what's going to happen to her. So they're now together. Okay. We need to know the other sister's name, which you already know is Leah. The word Leah means one who worries. Remember, we will see her, and when we see her, the most outstanding feature she has is the fact that she weeps constantly. The weeping comes from anxiety. Why is she anxious? Well, Laban has already told Rachel and Leah that they're going to marry Rebekah's sons, which would have been Esau and Jacob, obviously. Leah was the older child. Therefore, she would have married the elder son, Esau. Rachel would have married Jacob, which was what was going to happen anyway. But realizing the difference between Esau and Jacob, she understood that there was going to be a great deal of pain that's going to be involved in that. And so she was constantly in prayer, asking God to change it, to keep it from happening. Now, remember, Esau was not one without flaws. He was in a struggle too. His struggle was not with anxiety. His struggle was with good and evil. He constantly vacillated between doing what was right and doing what was wrong. Now, if we go back to the beginning of our chapter, just prior to this in chapter 28, when we finish the first 8 to 10 verses, we're going to find out that Esau was seen negatively in the eyes of both Isaac and Rebekah. And they were seen that way because he had married 2 Canaanite women. He had brought evil into the clan. And so he was already, when he finds out that Jacob is going up north to marry, or going east actually, to marry one of Laban's daughters, he goes to Ishmael and he grabs one of his granddaughters so that he becomes more like. Well, anyway, as we go through the story, we understand that there was a conflict within her about what was going on and how things were going to work out. Her destiny was going to be changed by Laban. And we're also going to find out the sin of Jacob, because Jacob commits an error, a very big error. So let's go to verses 9 to 12 in chapter 29. So now while he was speaking with them, Rachel had arrived with her father's flock, for she had been the shepherd. So she had gone through kissing her. By 13, it says, and it was when Laban heard the news of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran towards him, he embraced him, kissed him, and he took him to his house. And he recounted to Laban all the events. And then Laban said to him, nevertheless, you are my flesh and blood. And he stayed with him. So what are the events that he recalls? Well, obviously, there are 2 major events. One was the being robbed by Eliphaz, and the second one was spending the years with Shem and Eber. So those were the events. And he says, and he stayed with him for a month's time. Why? Nevertheless, you are my flesh. Laban was all about money. He was all about financial wealth. So I would have had to have assumed that what caused him to say those words would have been the fact that he lost out on what Jacob was going to bring for Rebekah, or for Rachel. So by verse number 15, it says, then Laban said to Jacob, just because you are my relative, should you serve me for nothing? Why is he going to serve him? Notice the order. Stayed with him a month. And then Laban said to Jacob, just because you are my relative, should you serve me for nothing? Tell me, what are your wages? Why is he serving him? What is he doing? 16, Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were tender, while Rachel was beautiful. She was Miss Universe in their eyes and understanding, beautiful in all appearance. And Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will work for you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. So the idea of working for a wage, evidently they had discussed the idea that he would stay there a while and that Laban would pay him. Jacob says, my only wage that I want is your daughter. And so that's what he worked for 7 years. Now, we know the rest of that story. We know the fact that on the night of the wedding, we know that Laban inserted Leah instead, which gave Leah, obviously, the opportunity to get out of the marriage with Esau. But she couldn't do that without the help of Rachel, and Rachel gave her the password so that Leah and Rachel, who were twin sisters, who probably had the same voices, and even though one is described as being pretty and the other one is described as having weeping problems, probably were very close to the same size. I can't imagine having a relationship that night with the sister of the person you thought you were going to marry. You would have had to have figured it out. Certainly the password would have helped make you think you were with the right person, but it wouldn't have been convincing enough. But anyway, so he accepts the fact that he was with Rachel when in fact he was with Leah. Now there's an understanding in Judaism, I think it comes in Nedarim, that a man, when he is having intercourse with a woman, thinks nothing of another woman, only of the one he's with. Now, this usually involves marriage, so put it in the right context. But in the course of the understanding, that would have meant that Jacob thought he was with Rachel when in fact he was with Leah. And so there are consequences in God's eyes for that event. And the consequence was Reuben. Now, Reuben himself, understand or remember, Reuben is the firstborn of the 12. Reuben, when Rachel has passed away and Jacob is about to go put his bed in the room with Bilhah, Rachel's concubine, and actually her half-sister. Bilhah and Zilpah are the half-sisters of Rachel and Leah. They're all related. Bilhah and Zilpah were from a second marriage. Rachel and Leah were from the first marriage. And so in the course of the time, in the course of this event, as we go through it, Reuben will steal the bed and put it in Leah's room, Leah's tent, to which Jacob becomes very angry. And at that point in time, now this is on their trip back to Israel, back to the land. And at this time, Jacob takes away from Reuben the rights of the firstborn, and instead doesn't give it to the secondborn, Simeon, but gives it to Joseph. Why Joseph? Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel. So he's giving the firstborn to the person he thought he was marrying in the first place. And so she will receive that first one. So Joseph will become the firstborn of Jacob. And that's why Jacob will eventually split the inheritance between Joseph's two sons, because he is the right of the firstborn. Back to our story. So anyway, back in our room at this particular point, having realized that he had been fooled, Jacob now has a problem. I didn't receive my wife, but I worked for you for 7 years. Well, Laban says, that's okay. If you worked for me another 7 years, I'll give you Rachel. Now, it's at that point in our story that the great Ari, the Arazal, Rabbi Luria, said Jacob went wrong. He created a fault, or what we would call a minor sin. His sin was the fact that he didn't trust God. Remember, God says, I'm going to take you and I'll keep you, and he doesn't trust God, he trusts Laban. Now, in the Kabbalah and Zohar, Laban is compared to or seen as the serpent. And so Jacob has been dealing with the serpent, just as Adam was dealing with the serpent way back when, and he was dealing with it over the idea of his wife and good and evil. So at this point in time, the Ari said he should have simply said no, taken Rachel with him, because that's who he had worked for, and they would have left. But they don't, they stay. And in the course of staying, we know that he works the next 7 years and he spotted sheep, and he goes to where he's back to his land. Now, going back to his land is not as easy as we thought, because we know that on the way back, Leah or Rachel has already taken the ephod, the statue that Laban used in order to do his divining. And so Jacob makes a swearing, there's no, your statue's not here. And if it was, whoever has it would die. Well, that's what exactly happened. But it was actually God's bringing that about, because there's another story. In the book of Leviticus, we are told that when a man marries, he may not marry two sisters. He may only marry one of the two. Jacob had already married both of them when he came back into the land. Now he's not under the Sinai covenant yet, but at the same time, he has been practicing the laws as best he possibly can. And so God will take away Rachel from him so that he is, in fact, following the 10 commandments, or following the 613, actually, following all of the commandments. Now, let me go back again. Let me start over. Why is Rachel and Leah born into the house of Laban, somebody who is so evil that he's compared to the serpent? Well, the understanding is that good has to work its way through evil in order to reach this earth. And so two righteous, what would become Zadokim, are being fought harshly by the Akra, the angel of death, or whatever you want to call him, Satan. And so God will put him, or put them, in the place that is wherever the klipot, the evil, thinks it's best. And so God allows those two to be put with Laban. Now, Laban and the rest are hoping that these women will change, that they will become like them, but they remain solid. Jacob comes down there to liberate them, to rescue them, to bring the sparks out with him. And so that is what's going on also. So there's multiple layers to every story. Nothing is completely one thing. Everything has story parts that are added to it. And so we're talking about the fact that everything goes there. So as we go through this story then, by verse 30, chapter 30, verse 9, when he's now got 11 of his children and he's going back, remember Reuben switches. Well, let's go to chapter 30. I want you to go to verse 9. Go to verse 7 first. Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, conceived again, and she bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, "Sacred schemes have I maneuvered to equal my sister, and I have also prevailed." And she called his name Naphtali. Now, when Leah saw that she had stopped giving birth, she took Zilpah, her maidservant, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, bore Jacob a son, and Leah named her son God. Good luck has come to me. And so that's why she called him that. Now, in the case of Bilhah, Rachel had already made a deal, just like Sarah had. Rachel understood that Sarah couldn't have children, so what she did was she offered her maidservant, her concubine, which was Hagar. Here, her concubine was her stepsister, her half-sister. And so she makes a deal with Jacob and offers him. Now, Leah, now seeing that Zilpah can also be used that way, because she understands we need 12. So she offers again her Zilpah. Well, the only problem was she forgot to tell Jacob. So when Jacob went into the tent that night, thinking he was with Bilhah and was with Zilpah, they created a child. The child was not the one that they were, it was not her fault or his fault, but it was a child of confusion because of the fact that they definitely did not consult with one another, because Jacob was not thinking about Zilpah, only Bilhah. Now, the next time this happens, because it will happen again, because Zilpah will go in with him again a second time. If you look at verse 12 on the next page, Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, bore a second son to Jacob. Leah declared, "It is my good fortune, for women have deemed me fortunate." So she called his name Asher. So the second one, Jacob understood who he was with, and the child's name was Asher. Now, there are 70 ways in which one can read and interpret words. In fact, I bought a book It's called the 70 Faces. It's 70 different ways one can interpret scripture. How you can interpret a letter, how you can interpret a word, how you can interpret a sentence, how you can interpret a paragraph, how you can interpret a section. One of the ways is by using the letters and reversing them. The letters that are used to make Asher are Aleph, Shin, Resh. If you reorganize the letters, you have Resh, Aleph, Shin, the word Rosh, or head. The second time, Jacob's head was in the story. He understood who he was with. Important insight, ideas. Okay.